Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm your host, Lauren Steiner, and with me are two wonderful guests, Deepa Varma and Greg Bonett. How you guys doing tonight?
Great. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us.
Sure. Tonight we're doing our show. This is the first show that I've done on affordable housing in California. And it's going to be the first of many because affordable housing is a real problem, as we all know, up and down the state. And there is a bill that is going to be voted on in the Housing Committee of the Assembly tomorrow that is very bad. And I'm going to have our guests tell you about the bill, but first I'm going to read their biographies. So Greg Bonett is a staff attorney with Public Counsel's Community Development Project here in Los Angeles. Greg works with community-based organizations to help build their capacity to engage in the land use and policy-making process and to preserve and develop affordable housing. Greg has also represented street vendors facing citations and continues to work with the LA Street Vendor Campaign to expand opportunities for low-income entrepreneurs. I may talk to you about that a little bit at the end, Greg, because I've been on the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, and that's something that we've, been working on.
Great.
Now, Deepa Varma is the executive director of the San Francisco Tenants Union. She has worked in tenants' rights as a tenant attorney for nearly 10 years. So again, great to have you guys on. Greg, why don't you tell us about SB 35 and why we should be worried about this?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for having me on. So SB 35 is a proposed law out of Sacramento that we're hearing that it's a bill that's supposed to help the development of affordable housing. But what it does is, for many jurisdictions across the state, it would allow developers to build projects. What we say is by right, and that means that many projects could get built without community input and without the environmental review that traditionally happens. And this really threatens to shut out low-income communities who are already facing rising rents and displacement pressures. This bill could shut them out from some of their few opportunities to have a say in what's built in their neighborhood.
Okay, so you've been following the progress of this bill. Who has been supporting it? Is this one of those bills like we're facing with SB 562, where the mod Democrats are all in cahoots to push this corporate bill forward?
Well, so I'm not deep in the weeds on exactly everyone who's in support and opposed, but I can say that it is something that even a handful of affordable housing developers have supported it, because it sort of gives the impression that this is something that's going to improve affordable housing in some jurisdictions. But there's a large group that's been opposing it, and it's really the folks that are in the cities where there's already at least where there's neighborhoods where there's a fair amount of construction, but that there's also serious concerns about displacement and rising rents and lack of community voice in the development process.
So what have our local representatives here in Los Angeles been doing about it? Because you're here in Los Angeles, you're probably more familiar with them.
Yeah, and honestly, I haven't been. I'm sorry to say, I haven't been in the weeds on tallying up who stands where on this bill. I think one of the challenges is that most people, for example, our position has been to oppose this bill unless it's amended. So a lot of people understand the need for affordable housing and building, and have really been just trying to get fixes in. So you'll see a lot of people engaging on this, and it's rarely is it a strong strict oppose or a strong strict support. It's usually oppose unless amended, or support but amendments are suggested.
Well, we hear that with other bills too. For instance, I just called my state assembly member, Richard Bloom, today to ask him to vote no on AB 398, which is this bill that Jerry Brown has crafted with the oil industry. Wachowski had a very good bill to extend the cap and trade program. And this bill, the one that Chevron wrote, is something that would actually be worse than the existing bill. It would actually give them more allowances to pollute. Because cap and trade is a market-based solution that allows the Richmond refinery, for example, to continue to pollute and poison the air of the residents in Richmond as long as they buy a rainforest in Bolivia or something. And what was interesting is Richard Bloom is really into housing. He's the guy, and we can talk about this later, who actually authored the bill to repeal Costa-Hawkins, the Costa-Hawkins Act. And so his staffer was telling me that they were going to add some housing amendments, some affordable housing amendments to this cap and trade bill in order to get the 2/3 majority they need without having to get Republicans involved. They wanted to get all the Democrats. And this is why Jimmy Gomez, who you probably know, has been reluctant to take his seat in Congress because Jerry Brown needed his vote for this cap and trade bill. So why don't we talk a little bit about the problem rather than this specific bill? Because you've been representing tenants. Tell us about some of the problems that people have been having with affordable housing and ways that you've been able to help them.
Sure. So, and I typically work with community-based organizations that are trying to shape local land use policy. So what obviously, I think this is an issue across the state. It's a huge issue in Los Angeles. I know it's a huge issue in San Francisco, but rents are going up and up, and low-income communities are getting pushed out of their homes. So in Los Angeles, we've been working on a number of measures that would try to facilitate the construction of affordable housing in an attempt to help bring those rents down and just have more affordable housing options, but at the same time preserving our existing affordable housing, both rent-controlled housing and also covenanted affordable housing, while also protecting tenants and making sure that communities have a say in decisions that affect them. So one example would be Measure JJJ here in Los Angeles. That sort of required that if developers were going to get a zone change or a general plan amendment that would let them build a much larger residential building, at least it put sort of a prerequisite that it include a certain amount of affordable housing and have certain labor standards for good jobs.
So where did you guys stand on Measure S?
So on Measure S, we opposed Measure S. This, of course, was a tricky. Everything in land use is tricky and controversial. There were tenant groups that supported it, but many also that opposed it, as well as affordable housing developers and community groups that opposed it. Our concern was that it would block many of the affordable housing developments that we need, and could also sort of shift development money towards some of these smaller, basically things like condo conversions. That it might shift developer money towards redeveloping existing rent-controlled housing stock. So we opposed Measure S. But it was obviously a contentious thing for the city. But I think even though some tenants groups split on that, I think there was agreement across the board that we need to be enhancing our tenant protections and protections against displacement, and increasing the stock of affordable housing and preserving affordable housing.
Well, I was in favor of Measure S, and that was because I felt that, there were billionaire developers that were backing it, and they were trying to say that if they have a moratorium, there's not going to be any affordable housing built. But guess what? Without the moratorium, there was no affordable housing built. So to me, as Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I thought that at least this bill would force them to use maybe the 9,000 parcels that the city of LA has to maybe build some public housing. But it's really interesting because as I've been exploring this issue a little bit more, somebody posted something on Reddit, which I thought was interesting. This was a guy who works in development, and he was saying how there are so many laws right now that require a parking space for every unit, some garden space, and not just a balcony, but actually an outdoor garden or roof garden for every unit. And by the time you add these things up, it makes it so the only thing that developers can afford to build is luxury housing. So what do you think of that?
You know, that does not sound right to me. In Los Angeles, we have many measures that, for areas near transit, significantly reduce the parking requirements. Of course, they require affordability, which they should. This idea that just reducing the parking requirements alone without affordability, or just building near transit without affordability, is going to have environmental impacts, I think is misguided. Really what we need is housing near transit with significant and deep affordability, as well as tenant protections. We can't be displacing tenants in order to get this. There have to be meaningful tenant protections on the way to that goal.
Well, the other thing that I was talking about with Josh was the fact that, he was using the term inclusionary housing. And I said, well, how is that different from affordable housing? Setting aside a certain percentage for affordable housing, you're calling it inclusionary housing. And he said that is because we want to have the low-income people living there in the building. Because right now what they can do is they can take money and set it aside for some affordable housing fund that somehow never gets to affordable housing. And the point was, it's kind of social policy as well as housing policy, because when you take people out of a low-income neighborhood where there's high unemployment, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of drug use, you're also not only giving them a place to live, but you're giving them an opportunity to live amongst middle-class people that may have, jobs, and there's not a lot of drug use or crime going on. Of course, what with the increasing wealth and income inequality, we're sort of losing our middle class. So I don't really know that we have that many middle-class neighborhoods anymore. But I thought that was an interesting point. And I remembered when all the way back to when I was living in Boston after I graduated college, I took a class in I was thinking of maybe majoring in getting a graduate degree in urban planning. And I took a class in housing policy at Tufts University and studied Section 8, which was really in its heyday back then. This was in the early 80s. And Section 8 allowed people to it was housing assistance so that they could move, like a single mom with a couple kids could move into a middle-class neighborhood and use that money for rent. And they hardly have that anymore, right? Hasn't that been somewhat phased out by the federal government?
Well, we still have Section 8, but the waiting list is tremendously long. I'm honestly, I'm not even sure if the Los Angeles waiting list is even open anymore. If it is, I think the waiting list is several years. And even for folks that get Section 8 vouchers, the rents in Los Angeles have gone so high that oftentimes the voucher won't cover the rent in many neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Add to that some landlords essentially discriminate against people who are with a Section 8 voucher. So even for those apartments where the voucher would cover a significant portion of the rent, they may face discrimination and be unable to rent there. But let me go back to something you mentioned earlier on this idea of inclusionary zoning. This is certainly something that advocates have pushed for a long time, and it would require that there would be affordable housing in all neighborhoods, not only in low-income neighborhoods, that we have affordable housing across the city. And many jurisdictions have adopted inclusionary housing laws, but the extent and the effectiveness of those policies have been stifled by a state law, the Costa Hawkins Act, which a court after the act was had been on the books for quite a while. A court had eventually interpreted it to limit cities' ability to adopt those inclusionary housing laws. And so advocates are definitely looking at ways to fix the state law to allow cities to have inclusionary zoning, and potentially just to repeal Costa-Hawkins entirely so that we can expand our rent control protections, which are just essential to tenants. Any tenant can tell you that the difference between being in a unit that's subject to the rent stabilization ordinance and being in a unit with no protections is night and day in terms of being at risk of just being kicked out at the landlord's whim, or being able to plan for the future that you might actually be able to stay there for the coming year and years to come. So I think that's a major issue for housing advocates in California.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the Ellis Act? Because I know that Richard Bloom introduced a bill to repeal it. It was like a one-sentence bill saying we're repealing the Ellis Act. And in April, the LA Times reported that he had to pull the bill because there was so much pushback from landlords associations. And it was kind of said that, you know what, this is going to be a 2-year bill. What we need to do is we need to organize to build support for it. And I know I've talked to a lot of Bernie-crats here in California, and we're going to work on that bill. But tell the viewers what the Costa-Hawkins Act actually did.
Right. Yeah. And so, just to clarify, I believe that bill was directed at repealing Costa-Hawkins, not Ellis, which is a separate issue that we could talk about later. But yeah.
You were just talking about the Ellis. I'm getting
no. I was talking about Costa-Hawkins. You had mentioned Ellis, which is a separate issue. But you're right. That bill, which looks like it's going to be a 2-year bill, would repeal Costa-Hawkins. And right. So Costa-Hawkins limits cities' ability to adopt. If cities that have existing rent stabilization and rent control ordinances, like Los Angeles does, like San Francisco does, like Santa Monica does,
and Beverly Hills even.
Beverly Hills has one, though it's fairly weak, but it's certainly better than nothing.
And Beverly Hills has a lot of renters. A lot of people don't know that, but Beverly Hills is not all rich people. Right.
And West Hollywood, of course, has a rent stabilization ordinance. But Costa-Hawkins limits municipalities' ability to basically to expand the coverage of those ordinances, or for municipalities that don't have them, it limits their ability to adopt them for newer construction. So in Los Angeles, for example, the city of Los Angeles, the rent stabilization ordinances covers units, I think it's 1978 and earlier, somewhere in that ballpark. But for units that were built after that, they're not subject to the rent stabilization. So yeah, you see folks that are just getting these double-digit rent increases, percent-wise, and it's incredibly disruptive, and it can really just, you and all your neighbors can get pushed out of a building in 60 days if things don't go right. So working to expand those protections would mean a lot for tenants.
Now let's talk about the Ellis Act, because that's another bad one that has to go. Define what that is.
Right. So the Ellis Act is another state law that, how it's phrased is that they say, it protects the landlord's right to go out of business. But in reality, it is abused, and the result is that in Los Angeles, we have tens of thousands of tenants who are evicted from rent-controlled units, rent-stabilized units, under these Ellis Act evictions. And if you go and you check out, I can try to put a link in the comments, but the anti-eviction mapping project, in combination with a local group, CES, the Coalition for Economic Survival, did a good job of mapping out where Ellis evictions were happening and when they were happening. And you'll see that I think we've had over 20,000 of these Ellis Act evictions from rent-stabilized units, and the rate is picking up. So it's one of the primary ways, or a significant way, that we're losing rent-stabilized units, some of which were affordable.
Well, I was reading about it, and it was supposed to be to protect the landlord's right not to have to be a landlord for the rest of his life. If he wanted to sell his building and get out of the landlord business, that's how he could do it. But it was abused, like you say, because during market upticks, that's when they started to try to get rid of people and time things so that when a unit became vacant, they didn't re-rent it until they could get, a lot of vacant units and then sell the whole building, or not even just sell the building, but tear the building down, build a new building and make it be like a condo building.
Right. Yeah. Condo conversions are a major, are another major issue, right? You'll go from having rent stabilized apartments to individually owned condos, where the affordability levels are just totally different. It's a major issue.
Now, can you talk about Airbnb? Because I've been following what's been going on in Venice. I was part of Occupy Venice, and I'm still on their Facebook page. And I'm reading a lot of stuff about Airbnb, entire buildings that are low-income apartment buildings. The landlords are renting them out for Airbnb, and because they can make a lot more money that way. And so the city council was supposed to be looking into some regulations on this, and I haven't been following it, but I understand Airbnb is a very powerful lobby, and they've been lobbying the city council. Can you speak to the status of that?
I wish, I'm sorry, I wish I could, I can't actually do much better than you. That I just know that it's a huge issue, and that the city council is exploring options to limit this. But I'm not. I should be up to speed on this, but unfortunately, I'm not. But it is. You can see the problem. You're taking units that used to be occupied by long-term residents, and that are on the they're on the market as apartment units, and you're turning those over to short-term rentals, so they're not necessarily occupied by residents, and it's reducing the stock of housing. And it's and oftentimes these are rent stabilized units, so it can be reducing the stock of rent stabilized housing. And I think there's even additional issues around them not necessarily paying the taxes and issues around that. But I know that there are measures to work to curb that, because, like you said, in Venice, it's really chewing up a lot of the housing stock and driving up rents.
Yeah, I mean, Venice is an interesting community because I've been watching as Abbot Kinney has gone from, basically a kind of a hip shopping street that locals could afford to set up their businesses on, to one where only like these big franchise stores come in. And like, I remember Hal's restaurant on Abbot Kinney was one, and Gin Patisserie was another. And I remember reading about, this was several years ago, that her rent went for Gin Patisserie, a local pastry store, went up to $30,000 a month. I mean, this is crazy. So this issue, and this has a lot to do with Google coming in there, what they call Silicon Beach. You have Google, you have Snapchat, and they've also been kind of harassing the homeless there in Venice. This issue is affecting the entire community. And the other thing is local, what was I going to say? Oh my gosh, I was going to make another point not about businesses. Homeowners. Okay, so what they're doing in Venice, which, they have these cute little bungalows, these small, maybe 1,500, 2,500 square feet houses at the most, very close together. People are buying them and building these really tall buildings, 2-story buildings, so that if you're in your backyard, if you can't afford to remodel your house and double its size, you're in your backyard getting a suntan or something, and your next door neighbor is staring right down at you, or your next door neighbor's second story is blocking your view, your sunlight. And this is crazy what's going on in Los Angeles. I mean, I just read the average rent is $2,300 a month, and that's up 12% from last year.
Right. Yeah. And I know what you're talking about with these single family homes that are bigger. I haven't really followed that. I know that there has been a lot of controversy around that. But with the rents increasing, that's exactly the issue. Rents are clearly going up far quicker than people's earnings are. And that's where we're already starting from a point where people were rent burdened to start with. So even before these dramatic increases in rent, people are paying 40, 50, 60% of their income in rent, and that's before these increases kick in. So it's chewing up a huge amount of people's income, especially for low-income households, and it's just getting worse.
Well, what do you think the solutions are?
Well, I think there's not going to be a single silver bullet. We have to approach this from lots of different angles, and I don't think there are really shortcuts either. But I think the general approach is that we do need more construction, but it has to always be mindful of preserving the existing affordable housing and rent stabilized housing, and giving communities a say in that construction. And that new construction needs to have affordable units included, or at least a minimum paid as a funding source, paid into a fund to build affordable units. So it's sort of a mix of, we need to create affordable housing, we need to preserve affordable housing, we need to have community input in that process, and we need to protect tenants.
Affordable housing funding has been dramatically cut by this governor. Since the recession, 70% of the affordable housing funding that existed already in California was cut and not replaced. And this year, even more of it is going to be cut under Trump's budget, under the federal budget and Trump's White House. So without affordable housing funding, how are we going to build affordable housing? So that's the first thing. Secondly, there's a huge challenge around income inequality. It's not just an issue of supply and demand of individual units. It's the fact that if one person can afford 5 or 6 vacation homes and other folks are struggling to fit 2 or 3 families into one unit or to make it into a shelter, it's just not going to work. I mean, the problem is just that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer in California and across the country. We need fair tax policy. And then third, we need to actually improve the laws we can improve in California. For example, we need to overturn Costa Hawkins. We need to pass stronger, better rent control, including in the places that already have it, but in other parts of the state that could use it, and improve tenant protections as well.
Well, what you're speaking about is the focus of my work. I mean, my show, The Robust Opposition, fights neoliberalism in all its forms. And when you have the private industry trying to get control of everything that should be a public good and public service, whether it's housing or healthcare or education, you know, the prison system, they're trying to frack in our public lands right now. I mean, this is what happens. There's been an incredible extraction of wealth from the people and the planet by these corporations and these billionaires, and it's just got to stop. I mean, it's why I joined the Occupy movement. It's why I supported Bernie Sanders' campaign. And I think the problem is that many of the issue groups are stuck in their silos. You know, you've got the housing people working on housing, and the education people are working on education, et cetera, et cetera. And unless we band together, it seems like unless there's some big social movement like Occupy or some campaign like the Sanders campaign, everybody goes back into their silos, and would be so much stronger if we could work together. What do you think of that, Deepa?
Folks who came together under the banner of our revolution worked to become delegates to the California Democratic Party that were outside of the regular political system, fighting for things like fully funded community college and healthcare. And and that housing also needs to be part of that platform. And I talked to many, many people who work in the healthcare field who are fighting hard for SB,
562.
You know the number. 563? 562. Folks were very interested in working on housing issues as well, and combining these issues, recognizing that healthcare issues, that housing is a healthcare issue as well. So I'm really excited to see more of those kind of intersections happening, as to work together on these issues and make sure to win. I also think it's really important to recognize that this build, build, build policy is not progressive policy. It's neoliberal policy. And so to make sure that we distinguish between the supply side policies that benefit developers and put more money into the pockets of the rich, and instead talk about actually the state taking care of the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and actually funding services everyone needs instead, which is more of a progressive style way of looking at housing policy.
I'm going to put in this comment by Peggy Kennedy because she's a fantastic activist with Occupy Venice, and she's been working for homeless and housing issues for years and years and years. Do any of you want to speak to the Mello Act?
We have the same challenge in San Francisco. There are against demolition of rent control units, but we have seen developers get away with skirting those when people aren't currently living in those spaces. And I mean, I think part of the problem is developers have so much power. Developers and landowners and developers are major funders of campaigns, and they have a huge amount of power within the Planning Commission as well. And what we're concerned about with something like SB 35 is removing the power that communities still do have within planning commissions to try to fight certain developments and just give all that power over to developers. So I am concerned about the kind of thing that Peggy, I think you said, mentioned. We are seeing that kind of thing, and we're expecting that would get worse with SB 35.
Now, Brandon put up this comment a little while ago about Scott Wiener, or Weiner, however you pronounce it. It always comes down to the outside influence of money in politics. And it's true. I mean, these developers in Los Angeles, they give a lot of money to the city council. And one of the whole reasons for Measure S was people are using these variances, right, to get around. What is the variance the right word? Is that the word I'm thinking of using in order to get their projects approved?
At least in Los Angeles, I mean that's one way, but I think it was more about amendments to the zoning code and amendments to the general plan.
Well, apparently the general plan has not been updated in like 25 years. So,
the general plan is made up of individual community plans. Many of those are well out of date, but JJJ in part addressed that, so where it said at least if you're going to get an amendment to the general plan, at least you have to provide affordable housing. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get an amendment, but at a minimum you have to provide some affordable housing. But yeah, the community plan needs to be updated, and it needs to be updated in a way that preserves affordable housing, encourages new affordable housing, and protects tenants, and explores other measures to protect communities that are facing displacement pressures.
Now, Deepa, Greg was mentioning that his organization works mostly with groups. Do you work with individual tenants to help them with their cases?
We do both. We are made up of, we're basically a union of tenants. Tenants come into our office every day for help and then become dues-paying members, and that's how we pay for our advocacy and staff. And we work with a number of coalitions locally within San Francisco and now regionally and statewide.
So that's a link to a coalition that we're a part of. And so let me just a small correction. I personally don't represent tenants, but Public Counsel does. It's just not. I work more with community groups, but Public Counsel does represent tenants in eviction defense and the like. But that link will go to the ACT LA, or Alliance for Community Transit website, and that's a local coalition that's over 35 or over 30 members, and it's been pushing for equitable development, and that centers the voices of low-income communities.
we have a T-shirt that says SFTU and ask you about your tenant rights.
All right. Well,
and then we have a lot of news on our Facebook, which I will share with you as well.
Now, what do we want people to do right now for this bill that's coming to the Housing Committee? Do we want people to call their assembly member, or just do we have a list of assembly members who are on the Housing Committee specifically that we want them to call?
It would be good if people call their assembly member themselves, as well as David Chu, who is the chair of the Housing Committee. I'm going to send a link right now with an article that gives more information about It's an op-ed about in 48 Hills about SB 35, and it's got David Chu's phone number at the bottom of it. He had a lot of pressure to support tenants in San Francisco, but he is right now waffling on supporting amendments that that the community is asking for. And if he hears from all of you, especially from folks outside of San Francisco, it might do a lot of good in terms of moving the bill towards being amended so that it doesn't have some of the worst harms.
Oh my God, I'm remembering who he is now. He's the guy that bussed people in to the Assembly District Delegate election, right? And tried to defeat the Bernie-crats.
That's right.
But he did not prevail.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so no, he's not a good guy. I take it back.
Right. He's got some good votes, but not necessarily across the board. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've talked about this topic enough for tonight. So before we go, maybe, Greg, you can talk a little bit about the work you're doing with street vendors and why that's so important.
Sure. Yeah. For those not in Los Angeles, Los Angeles has a huge number of folks that make a living through street vending, both either selling food or selling merchandise. It's somewhere in the tens of thousands of people in Los Angeles. I think the city has estimated, and it's really the only major city in the country where street vending is just illegal. And of course, this disproportionately targets low-income folks. It disproportionately targets immigrant communities, and it's really just bad policy. I mean, these are entrepreneurs that we should be celebrating and supporting, not criminalizing. So a couple of months ago, we did have a major victory where the city council saw some of the injustice in treating these folks as criminals and amended our municipal codes to get rid of some of the worst criminal penalties for sidewalk vending. They sort of decriminalized it, though the job's not quite done. There's a little bit of cleanup that needs to happen. Vending in parks is still a criminal matter, and there's a few other bits that need to get cleaned up. But now what we're hoping is that the city council will go beyond just decriminalizing and really make sure that there's a path for current vendors to get a license and develop their business without worrying about even getting a fine or anything like that. And so, yeah, we're hoping that the city adopts a really an inclusive and accessible process for folks to make a living legally, because they really do contribute a lot to our communities, and it's just bad policy to be shutting them out.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was more active in the LA Food Policy Council that one of our concerns was working with those street vendors to try to get them to sell more healthy food options. The Food Policy Council, and I would like to do a show with them, has been a great thing. People from all different areas concerned with food, whether it's community gardens or farmers markets or school food purchasing programs. We have a very healthy food purchasing program here at LAUSD, which is now we're worried about getting charterized because of that most expensive school board race in the nation, where Steve Zimmer, who was the good guy, lost to the charter-supported guy. But the Food Policy Council also had this great corner store conversion program where they helped corner store owners have healthier food options, taught them how to market them in the front of the store. And we also had a farmers market program where we raised money to match what food stamps could buy at a farmer's market, the Market Match program. And it's really interesting because in Los Angeles, when I did Occupy Fights Hunger back in 2013, or actually that was 2012, only 51% of the people that were eligible for food stamps in this city take advantage of them. And that's crazy because you have all this public money that's going to waste. And, the wealthy people, they certainly don't miss any federal money that's on the table, all the subsidies the oil companies get and whatnot. So I think it's really important that we talk about this all in like the bigger picture. So I am going to have someone from the Food Policy Council on in a future show. I want to thank you both for being on the show tonight, Greg and Deepa. Thank you both very much for being on. As usual, please follow me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, Lauren_Steiner. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lauren from LA, and continue to keep fighting. Bye, you guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Lauren.